Hello, it's Helen from Journal with Purpose and welcome to my latest journaling video. Today I'm going to be using a plain standard size traveller's notebook insert which I keep inside a vintage-like cover from Start Bay Notebooks. I'm going to be creating a vintage style spread, so I'm going to be using mainly different shades of brown. To start off with, I'm using these watercolours from London Gifties and I'm going to create a really wet mix using this light brown colour. The insert I'm using has Tomo River paper, so it will crinkle quite a lot under this wet watercolour, but I find that the paper smooths out really quickly once it goes back in the cover with the band around it. And if you don't have watercolour, I'm sure that you could use diluted tea or coffee to get a very similar effect. So now that that mix is ready, I'm going to drop lots of paint along the top left-hand page. I'm going to be letting the paint drip and run down my page, which is why I want it really wet to encourage that paint to travel. So I'm just adding lots of little blobs, and then I'm going to tilt my page upwards and encourage that paint to just travel and run down in whichever direction it wants to. And if the paint's not moving, I just use a wet brush underneath it. And that just gets those little drops running down. And if you give it a little shake and a tap, they should nicely create these little streaks down the page with the droplets at the bottom. And you can then either leave that to dry, or as I did, you can use a heat tool so that you can move on to the next page. I'm now going to turn my journal around and create the same effect on the opposite page. And this is something I really like doing. It's such a simple background and you'll never create exactly the same effect twice, and just gives a really interesting pattern that you can still write over the top of. Another really fun thing to do is use 2 or 3 different colours that are complementary, because then you can allow them all just to mix together and create different effects. So again, I'm just using a wet brush to help that paint travel a little bit further down the page. And once I'm happy with how that's looking, again, I dried off that second page. The next thing I'm going to do is use a stencil from my product range along with a Versa Magic chalk ink. And I'm using an ink blending tool just to push that ink through the stencil onto my page. And as always, I will leave links to all of the products that I mention in the description box down below. I really like this stencil because it gives the look of a torn washi tape strip, which is something that I'd usually add to the page, but I'll definitely be adding some washi tape later on in the video. Again, I'm going to do the exact same thing on the opposite page, just to try and make sure that everything looks well balanced. It was so nice to spend a little bit of time putting these journal pages together. In all, it probably took me about 50 minutes to create these journal pages. The next thing I'm going to do is some heat embossing, which I haven't done in absolutely ages. I found them when I was tidying up the other day and just knew I had to play with them. So I'm using a classic-y card from London Gifties and a floral stamp from my product range. And I've mounted that onto an acrylic stamp holder. And I've got this old embossing pad which still works really well, thankfully. So I'm making sure that lots of that goes onto the stamp, and then I'm pushing that down onto the card. and I found this lovely old copper coloured embossing powder in my stash. It was given to me by my mum years ago, and the only time I tend to think to use them is when I'm doing Christmas cards. So I'm just going to sprinkle that all over the stamped image, and then I'm going to tap the excess powder off onto this sheet of paper and pour all of the rest back into that pot. One of the things that I love about this is that the embossing powder pots are only small, but because you use so little on your projects, they can last you for absolutely ages. The next thing I'm going to do is use a heat tool to set that embossing powder, and it gives it this lovely metallic sheen. And it's always worth doing it on card because you need to get it quite hot. If you do it straight onto paper, you can find that it scorches your pages a little bit. I just think that looks so pretty, the way it shines. I love looking through all of my supplies and finding things that I haven't used in ages. And because I've only used it in card making before, it's great to realise that I can use them in my journals, and I think it's something I'll be doing quite a lot from now on. To add that card to my journal page, I'm using this brown washi tape from London Gifties, and I'm just adding a little of the tape to each side to make sure it's secure. I'm now adding a sticker from my product range that says "Today is the day," and I'll add a little bit of writing using a black Muji gel pen. And I find those pens work really well on lots of different surfaces, so I'll also be using it on those watercolour background pages too. I'd love to know how you've been getting on with your journaling so far this year, and if you've found any old supplies that you've suddenly been able to put to good use again. I'm going to be filming a tour of my kind of craft setup and storage very soon, and it'll be interesting for me to go back through all of those boxes as well and see what other treasures are in there. The next thing I'm doing is selecting some papers and tickets from this vintage bundle, which again comes from London Gifties. So I'm looking for whites and browns that I think will tie in nicely with my page. As always, I'm going to tear those pieces of paper to give them those lovely rough edges. And I will then be using some Pritt Stick to glue them down onto my page. I love the different layers and textures that you can so easily get just by adding some pieces of paper. And they're not very thick either, so they don't create lots of bulk and bumpiness in your journal. I really like adding lots of colour to my journal pages, but sometimes it's nice to stick with just one kind of colour theme. I think it just adds a certain peace and kind of cohesiveness to your journal. So I'm now tearing up that ticket as well and just moving everything around so that I've got it where I want it. And I always like to make sure that even with all of the different elements that I add, that I've got plenty of space to be able to write down everything that's in my head as well. When I'm creating my journal pages, I'm also taking some time to think about what I want to write about, and that kind of creative process of sticking everything down and adding the different decorative elements kind of really helps me to gain a perspective on things, and that really helps me with my journal writing too. In my journal, I'm going to be writing about self-doubt, which I'm sure is something which lots of people get affected by. And I added that sticker "Today is the day" because it just reminded me that Actually, if we just get started with things and don't let that self-doubt hold us back, where might we be this time next year? So that's what these journal pages are all about. I'm now adding some final pieces of decoration. So I've added another 2 strips of that brown washi tape. And I'm then using these pressed flower stickers from London Gifties. And the final sticker that I will be adding is from Kiruku. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. It's a lovely shop run by Anna Suna. And I'm going to add that sticker in the top left-hand corner. Finally, I'm going to add some pale washi tape just to help balance out the brown ink that I've used on the stenciling. And I really like just adding little elements that help to balance things out, and just some tiny strips of washi tape can really make a big difference. And with all of that done, I'm now going to move on to my journal writing. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be using that same black Muji gel pen. And that fresh perspective I got from just playing around and adding those creative elements actually changed my mindset a little bit, and I'm writing about how grateful I am to be surrounded by people that support me and believe in me. And that's so helpful if you're going through a period where you're kind of doubting yourself, is then thinking, well, actually, no, how lucky am I to have had some of the opportunities I've had, and to have other people that are still believing in me and offering me their support. So that's really what I wrote mostly about on these journal pages. I really hope that you've enjoyed watching this journaling video and it's inspired you to get documenting and creating, and perhaps looking through your stash of things to see what you can use. If you have enjoyed this video, it would be great if you would leave it with a thumbs up. And if you're new to my channel, I would love it if you would consider subscribing. As always, thank you ever so much for watching, and I look forward to speaking to you really soon in the next one.